Welcome everyone to yet another meeting of the IRWG, or a presentation from the IRWG. I'm Sarah Cullinan. I'm with Mass CEC, the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. We are one of the partners of the IRWG. The purpose of today's session is to hear from Dr. Destiny Knock of People's Energy Analytics, also affiliated with Carnegie Mellon. We brought on Dr. Knock to execute an energy equity scope of work that we envision to be supplemental to the E3 analyses and deliverables that we've presented in previous sessions. This work from Dr. Knock and the scope was the result of early stakeholder feedback that we should be doing more to supplement the analyses to consider differential impacts and equity impacts. So here we go. I'll kick it over to Dr. Knock in just one second. She'll present for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll have time at the end for questions. As you have questions throughout the session, you can put it in the Q&A, but we'll try to hold questions to the end. And we'll moderate them at that point. I think that's it in terms of logistics. So over to you, Dr. Knock.
Sweet. And I think, Austin, you have to let me screen share. Sweet. So hi, everybody, and thank you for taking the time to be here to listen to what I have recommended to the IRWG about the near-term report, and also how to include more considerations for energy affordability and energy justice into the work. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm a professor at Carnegie Mellon University, and I'm also the CEO of People's Energy Analytics, and all views, of course, are my own. And I have to say that the IRWG does not endorse the services of the company. So at a high level, I spent time reviewing the near-term strategy report, focusing on its structure around energy rates, and identified the potential impact on diverse households. And so based on my assessment, I do have several recommendations to adequately address energy affordability, protect vulnerable groups, and integrate a more data-driven and holistic approach to these types of analyses. So high-level overview of the recommendations are, I believe we really need to include a clear definition of energy affordability. I would love to see increased demographic designations. We want to enhance the data-driven methods to assess rate impacts and target at-risk customers. And specifically, this can help with protections for low and moderate income households. Number 4 is to include a holistic view of housing-related energy burdens. So we'll talk about the multiple types of energy poverty that I would like us to consider. And then 5, this will directly feed into integrating an approach for supporting at-risk customers through targeted marketing. And then number 6, last but not least, is continued support for upfront costs of fuel switching. So why do we need a definition of energy affordability? So energy poverty in the US has traditionally been defined using energy burden, which is the percent of income that a household spends on their energy bills. And here is a map of the US where the darkest color represents those that spend more than 19% of their income on the bills, and the lightest color represents those that spend less than 6% of their annual income on their energy bills. And one of the things is that with energy burden and that cost and expenditure concerns, this is really like the core of energy poverty. But if we go one layer out, we get to energy insecurity. So that's reliability and outage risk concerns plus energy burden. And then if we go a larger level out, this is where we are going to get to energy poverty, where we have like supply concerns plus energy insecurity plus energy burden. And so why do we need to think about this? So my question for many people, which I believe if I see, if you guys raise your hand as participants, I can actually see how many of you answered this. So my question is, how many people have experienced pipes freezing in your home because you or someone you know was trying to save money on your heating bills? So far we have two people. Oh yeah, the hand raising function does work. Great. I'm glad that we can get some interaction in this talk. So we have roughly 4 people, right? A little bit less than I expected in Massachusetts, at least when I lived in Massachusetts. We heard this a lot in the grad student community. So if you don't know anyone, well, now you know me, because this is me in my rental property here in Pittsburgh, where my tenants were working very hard to save roughly $200 on their energy bill. So they set their thermostat really low. And then in 2022, we had a Christmas cold snap, which led to the entire duplex losing access to water because all the pipes froze. So this is what used to be the kitchen, and them trying to save roughly $200 led to around $30,000 of damage. So with households, we know that there's this trade-off between energy and other necessities. So the ideal point is that everybody's energy needs are satisfied. But on one hand, we have those that prioritize energy consumption. So these houses might be experiencing high energy burden, so they're spending a lot of money on their energy bills, or they might have unsafe heating practices, such as heating with their ovens instead of using their centralized systems, or just using space heaters, which we know have a high fire risk. And then on the other hand, we have people that prioritize other necessities. So they're not, paying their energy bills or prioritizing that, which can lead them to an inability to cool or heat their home to desired temperatures. So this would be an example of a home that doesn't have an air conditioning unit. And instead of buying a window unit, that household has prioritized food and medicine, for example. Or these houses may be experiencing utility shutoffs. So energy burden misses the true fraction of what people are truly going through. So this is a graph of one household where this person makes $51,000 a year. So typically not considered in most low-income categories. And based on their energy bills, their energy burden is 4%. And so typically, right, if your energy burden is 6% or more, that's when you would be considered a high energy burden. So this home is not considered energy poor under the energy burden measure. But so that's just based on gross income. So when we include taxes with net income, dwelling costs, so rent and living costs, digital communications, which are so important in this post-pandemic world, and groceries, right? Their true spending on their energy bills from their disposable income is around 32% of their income. And one thing that we miss is that this is a 3-person household without an air conditioning unit. So this home isn't even able to adapt to heat waves or protect themselves from high heat times. So this household would be considered invisible under the energy burden measure. Also, as a side note, any homeless person would be considered invisible under the energy burden measure because they don't spend any money on their energy bills, right? So that is one reason why I always advocate for using multiple metrics. So our clear definition of energy affordability, the one that I have proposed for use is as follows. Energy affordability is the ability of a household to access reliable and sufficient energy services without compromising their financial well-being. So energy affordability encompasses energy costs, energy usage, efficiency, access to modern technologies, and the influence of policies and rate structures. And I do believe if we have like a more inclusive definition of energy affordability, then we can really tie in those multiple facets of, how homes are using energy. So my next recommendation, why should we increase demographic designations? So currently the analysis is focused on analyzing rate impacts across income and housing types. But one question, right, is what is the risk of ignoring age and race interactions? So based on census data, there is this graph, and one thing is we notice in older populations, minorities are not as prevalent. So what do I mean by that? So here, this first corner of the graph are babies. So people less than 1 year old, okay, infants, and the blue represents the non-Hispanic white population. This orange is the Hispanic or Latino population, and the yellow is the Black population. And as we move up in age groups, so we see here, 80 to 85 plus, the white populations are a significantly larger portion of this pie than all of the other minority categories. So one of the challenges that are often missed when we don't look at these, really fine-scaled designations are that minorities, unfortunately, in our country just do not live as long as our white populations. And so that does impact income, that influences generational wealth, right? And that just influences people's ability to maintain financial stability. So overall, my recommendation is to increase demographic designations. So, as I said, in the US, people of color are younger than white populations. And in 2017, the white population is the only subgroup with people under 40 accounting for less than half of the total population. And people over 60 are accounting for more than a quarter of the total population. And so, Americans, just to give you some of the actual numbers from those pie charts, Americans who are 80 and older make up about 4.8% of the white population, but no more than 2.5% of any other subgroup. So to increase demographic designations, I recommend that utilities should collect data via surveys or tie their address information to census demographic information. And this actually has been done in multiple utilities. So Salt River Project, which I worked with for one of my first research projects, deployed a survey to their customers, and that was in Arizona. And then Peoples Gas right here in Pittsburgh is currently working with my company, Peoples Energy Analytics, to tie census data to their households. And then we analyze natural gas usage across the heating season for multiple income and demographic groups. So then my third recommendation is to enhance data-driven methods to assess rate impacts and target at-risk customers. So the way that this would work is we would include demographic data using the surveys or the census. Then we would take energy bill and energy meter data, which would come directly from utilities. And that would also include outdoor weather data or temperature data, which would come from weather stations or organizations such as NOAA. And all of this would feed into tools for pairing these various data sets together. So that is, what I started as my research at Carnegie Mellon. How do we find energy poor households using meter data is what I created through my professor work. And then we spun that out into my company, People's Energy Analytics. And from using these algorithms to identify people, we can then identify hotspots for energy affordability issues, which I will go into very large detail throughout the rest of this talk. So I hope you guys are ready for this data ride. So we're going to go into an example of a data-driven method for holistic analysis of energy affordability. If people are interested in the technical papers, I've highlighted them here. Unveiling the Hidden Energy Poverty Using the Energy Equity Gap is published in Nature Communications. We also have inequalities across cooling and heating in households using energy equity gaps and energy policy. And if you guys are really tired of reading research papers, I also have YouTube videos where we talk about the findings from each of these papers, which I'll be happy to share. Okay, so right now I'm going to be talking about AMI data because I do think that that is the most granular, but full disclosure, we also do this with monthly data. So you can use AMI or monthly data to look at households. So what we do is we take meter data at the household level to understand energy consumption and behavior for individual households in the cooling and heating use or lack of use. So what we do is we take daily or monthly energy consumption in kilowatt hours or MMBTUs for the natural gas sector. We then, on the x-axis, have daily mean outdoor temperature in Fahrenheit. And for each individual household, we find the heating slope, which tells us how are people using energy as they move into deep freeze territory. The heating balance point tells us the first outdoor temperature at which houses cut on their heat. The base load lets us know all of the non-temperature dependent energy use. So this is going to be your water heating, your lighting, your cooking, right? All those things that you do throughout the year. Our cooling balance point tells us the first outdoor temperature at which households cut on their cooling systems. And then the cooling slope tells us how are people using their cooling systems as they're moving into heat wave territory. So what does this look like in practice? So here is an example of a household with electric heating, but no centralized air conditioning. So most likely a window unit. So again, we have our daily total electricity consumption on the y-axis. We have our daily average outdoor temperature on the x. The red represents the heating component, the yellow represents our base load, and the blue represents our cooling component. And each dot represents one day of the year for this household's energy use. And so we can see that they most likely only have a window unit, because if they had a centralized unit, we would expect this slope to be similar to the heating side. Then we also can find homes that don't have electric heating. So AKA, they don't have a heat pump, right? And so here, this home only has a cooling component and they have their base load. We also can find households that are at risk of heat stroke, meaning they don't have air conditioning unit. And also, fun fact, this home also does not have a heat pump, because we know that if they had a heat pump, we would expect to see a cooling component. So that is just giving you a slight flavor of some of the things that we can already identify just in terms of infrastructure gaps in addition to these energy uses. So now that we have a greater understanding of the houses, and again, for each household that we analyze, we run these individual regressions to understand how they're using energy and what is their infrastructure in the home. And so here is an example from Arizona when we worked in, we worked in Arizona, we were looking at their cooling sector. And so okay, so the inflection temperature is what I call the cooling balance point, and that's, again, the first outdoor temperature at which people turn on their cooling systems. The income groups are at the bottom. So 1 are people that make less than $15,000 a year. So that's less than national average minimum wage. Income group 8 are those that make more than $150,000 a year. And we looked at the difference between these groups. So here we found on average, people were turning on their air conditioning at 68.7 degrees Fahrenheit. Income group 8 was turning it on at 62.9 degrees Fahrenheit. And I want to remind you all that these are average temperatures, okay? So the average takes into account the high of the day and the low of the night. But if everyone was equal, regardless of income, we would expect everybody to be turning on their conditioners around the same time. But instead, we found a 6-degree difference, which highlights that this is an inequity within the system. And when we looked deeper, so then, the best thing about AMI data and meter data, even for monthly, is that we can look across multiple years. And so here we looked from 2015 to 2019. This inflection temperature, which I renamed to the cooling balance point, is, again, the first outdoor temperature at which people cut on their cooling systems. And the gray represents those that are making less than minimum wage. And then we increase an income group all the way up to the pink for those that make 150,000 or more. And one thing we notice about all of these lines is that there's not crisscrossing, right? So because each of these is a step function as we are increasing in income, this does help us understand that these energy equity gaps of 6 degrees roughly down to around almost 5 degrees, back up to 7 degrees, these are driven by income. And the gap was widening over time. And this widening over time was correlated with increasing electricity costs. So the average residential retail rate increased over time. And then, we also had to ask ourselves, okay, how might this be affected by retirement of high fossil fuel plants, build out of transmission as we are decarbonizing? So I told you all, though, that we should not only look at income, we should disaggregate by age and race analysis, right? So all that stuff was income. And now let's dig a couple layers deeper. So we looked at our energy equity gap across ethnicities. So again, we have our cooling balance points on the y-axis, and this time on the x-axis are different years, where the yellow is the Asian population, the blue is the Hispanic population, the gray is the white population, and the black is the black population. And we see, it's like, oh, it looks like, Black people on average are waiting the longest out of these racial groups to turn on their air conditioning systems. They're waiting until the temperatures are the highest. So the question is this a preference or is it an inequity, right? Let's go to the energy equity gap, because again, the energy equity gap looks at the difference in cooling periods between the lowest income group and the highest income group. And so with this energy equity gap, we see, okay, in 2015, this right here, this point is 11 degrees. So what does that mean in plain English? In plain English, that means that on average, low-income Blacks are waiting 11 degrees longer than high-income Blacks just to turn on their cooling units, right? So that indicates that this this long time of waiting to turn on their air conditioning units is not a preference across the entire racial group, that most likely it is an inequity based on income, even within this racial category. And one thing that is stark and concerning is that over the years, these income gaps have been increasing even within all of the racial categories. So even though over here and this yellow part, the Asian population looks like, it's starting to cool earlier and earlier in the season, while we see over here, when we look between income groups within this racial category of even the Asian population, we're getting close to 10 degrees. So the low income group is waiting 10 degrees longer than the high income group just to start using their cooling systems. And we can also do the same thing for heat. So the other thing is, now let's also look at the ages. Oh, whoops. So I meant to also say we had good distribution of demographics across the income categories. So that's something I typically get asked. What does the ethnicity look like across income groups? So the gray at the top is the white population, yellow is Asian, blue is Hispanic, and green is Black, and then these dark gray are other. So we actually did have a normal distribution roughly across these income groups. And so here, if you wanted to even go one more layer in, so we looked, got high and low income Blacks and high and low income Hispanics. So here we have our cooling balance points and inflection temperatures on the Y, our years are on the X. And again, the pink is the highest income group, the gray is the lowest income group, and the yellow is our second lowest income group. So one thing that this highlights for us is that, this gray bar is like actually doing okay in our Black population, but the yellow bar, so this is our second lowest income group, might need more information about subsidies. And these people might not be the ones that are targeted for information about subsidies, affordability programs, and those types of things. On the other hand, in our Hispanic population, the second lowest income group is within the others, but our lowest income group within the Hispanic population are waiting the longest. So this might indicate, okay, now we need to really reach out to the Hispanics in this lowest income category. So that is one way that we can also help inform our targeting. And so then we also want to look at age, right? So how does age impact energy affordability? So again, we had a good distribution of age groups across our different income categories. So the gray is going to be our youngest age group, which is 18 to 24 years old. And then our dark orange at the bottom is going to be our 75 years old and more. And again, 1 is the lowest income group, making less than minimum national average minimum wage. 8 is the highest income group, making 150,000 or more. So when we looked at age, an interesting thing here. So again, cooling balance point / inflection temperature on the Y, years along the X. These are the median inflection temperatures for each age category. And we do see some step functions, right? So we got our lower ages down here at the bottom, but then pink, which is 55 years to 64 years. And then we got our blue, which is 65 to 74 years old. And then our orange, which is the highest, is our 75 years and older. And so when we looked within these age categories across them, it is interesting that there are similar gaps between low income and high income people within these age categories for almost all of them, except for our lowest age group, right? So, and that could be one of the things between like people who start off at tech companies versus people that are starting off working at like Starbucks, for example, or like Walmart. And so, those disparities are things that we can like account for. And it's just like, really good for us to understand, like, do we need to target everyone within that age category? So like how we see this orange line for our 75 years and older, across the years, there's really a 5-degree gap. So maybe we need to actually say, okay, let's go talk to everyone up here. But in this green category, even though we might not have targeted the younger population if we just looked at the medians across, when we look over here, we see, this disparity between high income and low income of this 18 to 24 category is almost 20 degrees. That really does indicate that we, should reach out to some of the more marginalized people within this lower age category. And so we can also dig one layer deeper into this, right? Like we did with the racial groups where we're looking, okay, within these categories, let's look at specific incomes and how that's changing over the years. Whoops. And then we can track this, because we can track this across years, we can also track this across temperature changes. We can track this across external shocks like the COVID pandemic and really get a better understanding of how people are being impacted. Okay, so the other thing that we can do, of course, is tying this back to how does the residential retail rate or price for electricity impact, how people are using that. So we looked at maximum average monthly temperatures. We looked at cooling degree days. Of course, we looked at residential electricity retail prices. That's relevant here. And then we also looked at the energy equity gap, which again is the how people in low and high income groups are using their cooling and heating systems differently. And so one thing that we notice is that behavior changes do take a while to catch up to price and temperature shifts. So if we think about the way that people see their energy bills, it does take about a year for them to respond to price changes. So when we saw this rate increase by 2% or 2.4%, we saw a 10% increase in the energy equity gap. So low income groups were waiting longer to use their energy systems. And then when there was a 2.5% increase in the high heat days and a further 2.7% increase in the residential retail price, we saw a 44% increase in the gap between high and low income groups when they were using their cooling systems. So one thing that I do believe would help further understand the implications of rate impacts on low-income groups is a finer analysis, because we were looking at these changes across the entire population, but we know that people are on different plans, different subsidies, different assistance programs. And so I do believe that this type of analysis, it can be done in a holistic way to understand how are people adapting to rate changes over time. So some high-level takeaways from what we can do with the data analysis of what I showed you from Arizona is that, is that we took the electricity usage in households, and we also can do this with natural gas houses. So we did that on the y-axis. We have the outdoor temperature on the x-axis, and right now our blue represents our high-income homes, who we would assume are using energy regardless of without thinking too much about whether or not they can afford their bills. Then we found the cooling balance point, which is when a household turns on their air conditioning unit. And we also plotted the low income households, which is here in black. And we found that there's this cooling energy equity gap between low and high income households, which is about 4 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit. We found that in Arizona, and I will also let you know, we also found it in Chicago. So we replicated our Arizona analysis in Chicago, and we found cooling gaps in both. Now, the other thing that we did in Chicago was we also looked at the winter, right? And in the winter, we found the opposite effect, where low-income groups are using heat earlier in the winter season, most likely due to insulation. So one thing that we saw through the residential electricity consumption survey that the U.S. Information Administration put out is they asked people where do they set their thermostats. And typically people set their thermostats within 1 or 2 degrees of each other. But in our analysis in Chicago, we found that the difference in terms of heating use is that low-income groups are actually seeing their heating systems kick on 6 to 10 degrees earlier than high-income groups. Now, if you have a leaky roof, bad windows, no insulation in your walls, which we see in older homes, which are where low-income people typically live, that makes sense, right? But it also leads to higher bills, and it really is hard to disaggregate the housing poverty from energy poverty. Now, the other thing that we are also able to do with our data analytics is we are able to look at the differences in slopes. So how are people using their heating or cooling systems as they're moving into heat wave or deep freeze territory? And spoiler, we did find that there is a gap. So even when we controlled for household size, when we controlled for number of air conditioning units or heating system type, we did find that low-income groups are consistently using less energy as they're moving into heat wave or deep freeze territory. So I started off this talk by saying that energy burden may miss some homes. So the other thing that we can do using meter data is we can calculate the energy burden, right? So that is what we did here, where the number of households are on the y-axis, the energy burden on a log scale is on the x-axis, and this red line represents when the energy burden of 10% threshold. So do people spend more than 10% of their income on their energy bills? And we see in 2015, the energy burden was about 2.7%. It decreased to 2.4%, and then it went back up to 2.7%. So from an energy burden standpoint, it looks like we are almost exactly, well, we're exactly where we started. So the question becomes, how many households do you believe overlapped? So when we did the Arizona analysis, our energy equity gap second tier, which are households that wait until it's above 78 degrees Fahrenheit to start using their cooling systems, we found 86 energy poor under that measure. And under the energy burden 10% threshold, we found roughly 141 energy poor households. And so, I can't see the chat. I think the chat was disabled for this one. So I guess just keep in your mind, okay, how many houses do you believe overlapped? Is it, 10? Is it 30? Is it 100? Right. Counting down from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, hopefully you have, your guess for how many overlapped. Dun, 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 dun. Only 3. So when we looked to see who was energy poor under our energy burden threshold and who was energy poor under our energy equity gap for limiting their air conditioning usage, only 3 out of 4,577 households were identified as both energy poor under these 2 measures. And so if we only use energy burden, we would be leaving out 83 households that were not able to protect themselves from heat waves. So you might be asking, well, why is that? So when we replicated this in Chicago, we also found similar lack of overlap. And we were wondering, okay, like what is happening here? So the orange represents energy burden of houses that are above 6% in Chicago. And, when we looked at the details, high energy burden assumes working energy infrastructure or a centralized air conditioning unit, but these houses might not have insulation. So we're like, okay, that makes sense. A working air conditioning unit, a working heating system, that actually represents 40 to 70% of your energy bill, right? But then we have energy limiting behavior early in the season. These are people that delay turning on their AC, they delay turning on their heating system. So they're really smart, they're really savvy. They're like, we're not going to use our thermostat because we want to save money on our bill. So they're really trying not to do that. Then here in Chicago, the biggest category of energy poverty or energy insecurity that we found was people who just limit their consumption throughout the season. So these are people with really low cooling slopes, really low heating slopes, because this indicates a broken or no air conditioning system or no heating system. So people's coping mechanisms for how they cope with and try to get out of their poverty situation are really going to indicate how they're going to show up in analysis, which is why I really advocate for using multiple metrics. So, this right here, I showed you for the cooling sector, but we also do the same analysis and we identify multiple risk categories also for the heating sector as well. And I do think that's the benefit of using meter data tied with these demographic designations. And so that brings me to my recommendation 4 and 5, which is there needs to be a holistic approach and better targeting for households that are at risk. Because like these two people here, not everybody is going to have really high bills. Some people are going to be suffering in silence within their homes. So one thing that I have proposed, which we actually made through my company, is these customer classification dashboards. So here in the Chicago area, on this end, you see the zip code hotspots where we have high energy burden homes down here in this quadrant. But over here in this quadrant, there's like, oh, there's some people that might need help, but if we're going to only do this from a zip code standpoint, let's go talk to everyone here. But what we do is once you click on this zip code, the accounts that are the most at risk are tied with their risk category. So now you can go into any zip code and figure out who are the most at-risk households. And each of these accounts is tied to an address, is tied to an email, is tied to a phone number, and then we can directly market to those homes. And we do this not only for high energy burden or financial risk, but we also do this for a lack of air conditioning units, broken heating systems, and those that are limiting their cooling and their heating usage to find them. So now all of you guys know, if people say this is too expensive, tell them, no, it's not, because we have gotten the cost down to less than a penny per household, right? So we are finding homes and marketing to them information about customer assistance programs, energy efficient technologies, and that type of thing for less than a penny a household. They don't have to use my company. If they want to do it themselves, that's fine by me. But really using meter data allows us to look at individuals, which is the key to solving energy insecurity and energy poverty. And understanding rate impacts, right? Because now the other thing that we can do is we can track these financial risks and the other risk metrics over time. And so then we can actually see once the rate increased, yes, okay, maybe energy burden didn't go up, but is that because people have started delaying turning on their heating systems or they've delayed turning on their air conditioning systems? So in summary, meter data can benefit low and moderate income customers through enhancing the targeting. So we can identify multiple at-risk households at the individual level, which is very important. We can facilitate individual targeting of homes for energy upgrades, bill assistance, and energy efficiency deployments. We can identify households that are at risk of heat stroke due to lack of air conditioning use or at risk of cold illness due to lack of heating use. And we can just find households that need help early on. So examples of utilities doing this currently are Peoples Gas, which is in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Southern Company, which spans 9 million houses across Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. And I can confidently say that those utilities are doing that because I have multi-year contracts with each of these utility companies through my company, People's Energy Analytics, and we are deploying the analytics in their service territories. Okay, and then last but not least, I would advocate for continuing the support for upfront costs of fuel switching. So I think the near-term rate strategy does a great job of addressing the operational costs of electrification in great detail. I do think that there is an opportunity to just, add how upfront costs will continue to be a large factor in accelerating or impeding electrification in low to moderate income households. And I will acknowledge that in Massachusetts, there are very generous incentives for subsidizing heat pumps 100% for low-income households. But I do believe utilities should use targeted marketing to make sure that people are aware of these programs, and then also use the meter data to track how people getting signed up for heat pumps and adopting this technology changes their financial risk, changes their pipe freeze risk, and also changes their heat stroke risk. And lastly, just supporting upfront costs is important for managing the renter versus owner dynamic, because bill savings don't always sway building owners to adopt heat pumps, right? So these upfront cost incentives are very important for electrifying renter-based households. So, quick recap of our recommendations is I would love to see a clear definition of energy affordability included, and I have proposed one, which I believe will be in an appendix attached to the report. I do believe that we need to increase demographic designations. Income is a very important factor, but also understanding how people within age and racial risk categories are also intersecting with the energy system can be important. I think that we should really, scale up our data-driven methods for assessing rate impacts and targeting at-risk customers, which can help protect low and moderate income households. And I think that all of this can feed into a holistic view of housing-related energy burdens and energy insecurity, as well as creating an integrated approach for supporting at-risk customers and support upfront costs of fuel switching. So the quick recap about how to identify hotspots for energy affordability issues is to take in these different data sets, feed that into tools for pairing these data sets to identify energy bill and impacts on energy use across outdoor temperature data. And, this is really important for identifying hotspots in energy affordability. And some of these hotspots include like just who can afford their energy bills, right? How can we make sure that people are aware of these programs? And as I mentioned before, multiple utilities are doing this, so there is precedence. Okay, so in conclusion, I think that by adopting these recommendations, the plan can help make the transition to electrification more accessible and sustainable for all households, particularly those most vulnerable to rising energy costs and energy-related hardships. So I want to thank everyone for listening and attending this talk. And I really am looking forward to the discussion on how we can make sure that we are fully capturing and expanding our understanding of energy affordability issues. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Knock. This is such a rich amount of information. And it's, I guess one thing I want to make clear is that the analyses that Dr. Knock was discussing, we're not using Massachusetts data. We're not able for, we didn't have access to, weren't able to for this effort to do that for Massachusetts. So Dr. Knock's recommendations will speak to how we can go in the direction of doing this for Massachusetts. So happy to turn to question. Oh, a couple of things I want to mention. Reminder that this is being recorded, so you can share with all your family and friends and colleagues after, and go back to refer to it. We will also share the slides. Yeah, I think now we can turn to questions. There are a couple that popped up in the chat. A couple we answered, the ones that we haven't yet, not ignoring. I just thought it would be easier to answer some of those live. There's a couple that are more targeted toward IRWG rather than Dr. Knox. So I'll start with those, and then we'll move on to questions for Dr. Knox. So the question was asked how the recommendations will be integrated into the E3 study and how it will adjust the short-term and long-term strategy, considering the fact that the equity analysis is coming at the back end of the IRWG process. So while Dr. Knox is presenting at this point, she has done a review of the near-term strategy ahead of it being finalized and has contributed to recommendations as well. So her opinions and work are being integrated into those deliverables. The same will happen with the long term. The other two of the others I'll leave for Dr. Knopf. Another question, since Massachusetts is not carrying out this type of analysis, and therefore any rate recommendations from the IRWG and E3 will be missing very important data. Agree that these types of analyses done for Massachusetts would be extremely important and would give us a whole other important level of granularity and understanding the impact of changes to rates. Like I said, we were not able to do it for this analysis, but the Dr. Knox methods and the types of work that can be done are in the recommendations to be considered, to continue to be considered by stakeholders and by DPU as well. All right. Dr. Knock, I think, do you have access to the chat? Can you see the questions coming in?
I do see the Q&A, yes.
Great. Do you want to start answering the ones that are more questions for you?
Yes, of course. Okay, so is the data that is being discussed all from nationwide census data? So in terms of the electricity data that I discussed and the natural gas data that I discussed, that is directly from electric and gas utilities. So it's not from census data, like I guess I should have made that more clear. So the data that I get from utilities, it is either month by month for each individual household, or it is hour by hour. My battery's about to die. Okay, plugging in my computer. All right. Okay, so it's either month by month or day by day for each individual home. So we are able, that's how we are able to get way more detailed for these individual analyses and how we can look at the intersections between race and income or age and income, because we had that information for the individual level. That's also how, so I didn't present all of the slopes analysis that we did here just for sake of time and ability to discuss questions. But when we were looking at the energy slopes, we actually were also able to look across household type, household age, number of air conditioning units. And again, that's because that utility chose to do a detailed survey. And that's when we were really able to dive into all the intersections. Now in the Chicago analysis, that utility did not want to do a survey, and we did pair the demographic information from national-wide census data, but that was like based on the location data that they gave us. And then each home's energy usage was given to us at the 30-minute interval. And we were then able to look across seasons, and we looked across multiple years. Like, for example, we looked before and during the COVID pandemic even to see how did energy usage change. Okay. Sweet. So one question says, thank you for sharing this. As we wait for AMI to roll out, would you consider laying energy burden findings with something like an extreme heat analysis to find energy burden hotspots in addition to income, or what strategies could be used to identify high-risk areas? So I will say that right now, we just do this on meter data as well. So while you are waiting for AMI data, like I do think AMI data is great for understanding like within the season, when are people turning on their air conditioning units, but the slope analysis can be done across the year using monthly data, because again, we want to see how are people using their heating and cooling systems from like spring, fall, as we move into like summer, winter, right? And so that slope analysis is going to be able to be done. And we are doing that right now with People's Gas, and we are using that to test the targeted marketing for households within People's Gas here in Pittsburgh. We're running it on 62,000 homes. So I would say that like doing that analysis at the beginning with, I guess, as you called it, an extreme heat analysis. You can also do an extreme cold analysis for your heating as well. You can do it in both natural gas and actually you could probably do it in all of them as long as you have monthly information. With oil tank fill-ups, it'd be a little complicated because again, you want to know how people are using their energy across the season. But as long as you had like a monthly reading of an energy type, then you can do that and layer it on. And I do think that that will at least let you know like who is just not using enough energy during, when it's like freezing outside or during like the high heat time periods. Okay, so I think that answers that. What resources would be necessary to do studies with Massachusetts specific rate analysis and demographics? Can EEA fund it? The funding question is not something I can answer. But in terms of the resources that would be necessary to do studies with the Massachusetts specific rate analysis, I mean, that's really like a collaboration with the utilities. And one thing that we have found is utilities are willing to pay for this. So People's Gas in Pittsburgh and Southern Company in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, they are paying customers of the company. We're not doing this analysis for free. And it is because like, these companies have operating budgets for targeting their low and moderate income households. They have operating budgets for marketing expenditure. They have operating budgets for reducing disconnections, and at least they should, right? And also deploying programs. And so those operating budgets are typically what are used to pay my company for the data analytics and the targeted marketing. And it's like, yes, we will need to still knock on some doors, but really it's like, imagine how many times you can reach out to a home if you're texting them, as opposed to trying to, door knock on everybody in a zip code. And so then now that we're using like this targeted marketing in a digital space, right, it does take down the cost of all those resources, because now you can use your manpower for the people that we identified as not having the cell phone capabilities of signing up for these programs, or the people that didn't respond to the in-app message, right? But you actually can get like a good chunk of them, right, through the in-app messages, through their portals where they already pay their bills. So I think that that's, kind of one thing where I do believe that there is a lot of opportunity to collaborate with utilities as long as you guys get them on board, right? Because yeah, we do know that, helping people pay their bills is good for business. So yeah, data sharing, and that's the biggest one, is the biggest resource we're gonna need. Okay. The most glaring gap appears to be age-related. When we look at the energy equity gap versus age, slide 29, is that my impression as well? So in terms of the biggest energy equity gap, yes, I do agree that in Arizona, the 18 to 24-year-old group, the gap was almost 20 degrees Fahrenheit. That was the most glaring. And so, I do think that is something that it can be like kind of easy to pass over, right? Like college students are a risky population, right? Like people that are just making it out of school on their own, they are at risk. And it's not something I often hear talked about. I do, at least when I go to like church events or I go into the community to talk to people, I do often hear like, how do we get more elderly population signed up? But that was something that was very surprising to us, this 18 to 24-year-old gap between income groups. And I think that that's one of the reasons why I like to do this more disaggregated analysis, because then you can really like kind of pinpoint who has been missed in our current outreach efforts and try to use the targeted marketing for them, right? And so then the question is, okay, how do we reach those people? Is it through text messaging? Is it through email? Is it through in-app messages? Which demographic does that work for the best? And then how can we now more efficiently allocate our resources to be effective with the other age groups? But I will also say, in the racial groups, those 10-degree gaps, I mean, 10 degrees is still a big difference. Like, you know, if it's 10 degrees, that means when it's on average 60 degrees, you know, some people are waiting till the average is like 70 degrees to turn one. And so just to get a good frame of reference, when the average temperature in Arizona was 75 degrees outside, that meant that the high of the day was well above 90 degrees. So remember, those averages can be a little deceiving because the highs of the day are much higher because you have to average the high and the low. Okay. Can I provide explicit examples of how to overcome the renter-landlord issues regarding taking advantage of energy efficiency incentives? So that is a good question. I think that one of the things that I have been working on is trying to really get to who pays the bill, because I think that that can be one of the challenges. So, for example, I am a landlord here in Pittsburgh, and one of the things that we tried to do was to adopt energy efficiency technologies once all those pipes froze in the house. So if you remember those pipes freezing picture, that was $30,000 of damage. All the walls were open. And we were thinking that would have been the perfect time to electrify the whole duplex. But the challenge was we couldn't do that using using our energy efficiency incentives unless we had a low-income tenant living there, because we didn't qualify and the resident was supposed to qualify. Well, the problem was the nonprofit we were working with said, this house is unlivable. You can't have a low-income tenant living here. So now what happens? Well, we can't get these energy efficiency upgrades. We can't get the house properly weatherized completely. And they're saying I had to pay for it all myself. In addition to the $30,000 rehab I have to pay for in this house, plus the $6,000 of pipes. So long story short, unfortunately, I did not electrify my house, even though I strongly do believe in electrification. But that's like one of the, I think, challenges with the gaps between like renters and landlords, is it does matter like who's paying the bill, because they're going to be incentivized to adopt the incentives. But then two, like, does adopting those things make the house unusable? Because even now when we have a tenant in there, we did ask them if they wanted to consider getting some of these energy efficiency upgrades, and they just don't want their lives disrupted, right? So unfortunately, I don't have an explicit example of taking advantage of energy efficiency incentives, because I have not found success in my own life, even though I've tried to. But I do think that hopefully we are a big group of people. So hopefully somebody else can share their experience of having success. Okay. All right, Mary. Oh, hi, Mary. So said, we have found it difficult to access the type of data I've shared from utilities in Massachusetts. Have I worked with Massachusetts utilities, or do I think that I can easily access that data? Linking census data to utility data apparently raises privacy concerns. How do you go around that? So I have, I'm open to working with anybody, and I actually have talked to National Grid before. There seemed like there was some interest, but maybe we need like an energy advocate to to help solidify that collaboration. So it is one of those things of privacy concerns often comes up. That has come up with every utility I have tried to work with. And so West Southern, though, we had to go through a security protocol, and we've been doing it for roughly 4 months. So our company is cybersecurity certified under Southern's agreements, and we are working on becoming SOC 2 Type 2 certified, which is one of the highest security settings. It's what some people use to like be able to handle healthcare data, for example. So I do think that like that's one of the reasons why, you know, I used to do all this under my academic umbrella only, but then the company is one way I've tried to overcome some of those because I can have a little bit more control over privacy concerns. I don't have to publish all of my findings once I do it through the company. So that is one way I've tried to overcome it. So in terms of easily accessing the data, it really does require a partnership with the utility. And one reason for that, right, is you want to know what rate plans people are on. You want to know how people are using their energy over the season, and you want to know where those people are. So the utility does have the location data. Even if the utility doesn't share the addresses, they can share the census, they can share the zip code, right? They can share some sort of location. And that is how People's Gas shared their data with us to limit the personally identifiable information. And also ComEd, they actually publish their data online and you can buy it. They anonymize it. They do attach a location to it. So there is precedence in other utilities that are making the data more available. So, you know, that's one of the things is I believe that oftentimes utilities cite privacy concerns, but there are multiple utilities that are sharing the data and just increasing the privacy of that data. So I believe that we can get around that. Okay. Can I talk a bit more about how moratoriums, such as the one in Chicago implemented during the pandemic, impacted energy lending behaviors, if at all? So one thing, so in a separate paper that we published about the pandemic, it's called Inequitable and Heterogeneous Energy Consumption Impacts of the COVID-19 Pandemic. And that was published in iScience. And so one of the things we did was we did look at how energy consumption changed in both Chicago/Illinois and in Arizona. And during the moratorium periods, we did see energy usage go up. I want to say it was roughly 11%, but don't quote me on that. I would have to get the paper to give you the exact numbers. But we did see electricity use increase during those time periods. And to me, that indicates that there is this energy limiting behavior occurring because people are trying to limit. And then once they felt that they did not have to worry about being disconnected from service, we did see overall populations across the board increasing their electricity use. So I do think that that does signify that there is a gap in, you know, what people want to consume, what they versus what they actually feel like they're able to consume. And then during the COVID-19 pandemic, we actually deployed a survey through my group, and that paper is published under, it's called Comfort or Cash. And roughly half of the people making $35,000 or less stated that they actively limit their energy consumption to save money on their bills. And then the others said that's like sometimes they limit to save money on their bills, other times they feel okay. And so that in and of itself is highlighting that people are aware that they are kind of limiting on purpose, right? But it also like highlights that they're using different coping strategies across these different time periods. Okay. So another question is, do I have an idea of affordability metrics that can be tied to rate making to accomplish the issues that I raised? So, and I am a metrics person. That my whole PhD is on making metrics, right? How do we use math to measure what we care about? And one of the things that I feel like has been missed with the energy burden measure is it was never just about the income. So with energy burden, the original definition was that people should not spend more than 10% of their income on their energy bills to keep their houses warmer than I believe was 63 degrees Fahrenheit, right? So the comfort of the home and the income that it takes to achieve that comfort was the original definition of energy burden, and it's under fuel poverty by Brenda Boardman, 1991, if you want to look it up. So I do believe that we do need to tie both energy burden, energy limiting behavior early in the season, and energy limiting behavior throughout the season to rate making. And that is because if the rates go up and all of a sudden people are not using as much energy, that can indicate the cost of comfort, right? If people are given energy efficient appliances, sometimes people say, oh no, this is bad because the energy burden increased, right? That's sometimes what I hear about heat pumps. Oh my goodness, we gave these homes heat pumps and now their energy burden went up. It was a bad thing. Well, no, it's not a bad thing all the time, because one, heat pumps allow you to use more energy at a lower cost. So sometimes people want to use more. So sometimes increasing is an alleviation of poverty. The other thing is there's a lot of homes in Massachusetts without air conditioning systems. I know, I lived in 3 of them without air conditioning systems when I did my PhD at UMass Amherst. And it was hot. Like, it was very hot in there. I remember taking cold showers, going to sleep, waking up because I was burning up, taking another cold shower and going back to sleep and waking up when I was dry. And so it gets hot up there for, roughly your 3 weeks of your heat wave. And so if people are not able to have an air conditioning unit or they don't have one, but then all of a sudden you give them a heat pump, right? Even if their energy burden goes up in the summer, that can also indicate an alleviation of poverty, because now that's something that people are willing to prioritize. So I do think that, like, tying energy burden, energy limit behavior early season and energy limit behavior later season are important to evaluate the impact of rates. Which is why I tried to make metrics that are scalable, right? That you can do using meter data. As I said, cost less than a penny a household. We can run an analysis on 1 million houses in less than a month. So there's really, I feel like, not a reason not to do it. Okay, and then last but not least, Dr. Nuck, have you found that utility companies are forthcoming with sharing the data with you? So I will say that, I've worked with Salt River Project. I've used the Chicago data from ComEd. I have Southern Company now in the South, and People's Gas here in Pittsburgh. And so that's 4 already. And I just published my study in 2022. So in 2 years, 4 utilities, right? So to me, that does indicate that there is an appetite for this, and utilities have been willing to share the data with me. And I think it's because, I want to make I want to make the world a better place, right? And I think that that's something that utilities do need to, like, fully see in terms of, like, being willing to share the data. They have to see the benefits. Yeah. Okay, so Mary said, our electricity rates are very high. Switching from gas to heat pumps are also high. So she disagrees. The comfort equation is not worth, at this point, the high increase in the Commonwealth. So I just want to clarify that I was not, okay, let's see. The comfort equation is not worth at this point. So I want to just clarify that what I was saying is that we need to track people's ability to make their homes comfortable. So for example, with heat pumps, switching from gas to a heat pump, Mary's saying would be a high cost. And what I was trying to communicate, which I'm going to try to do a better job of communicating this time, is that if you only use the energy burden measure, so how much money are people spending on their bills, if their bills go up when they switch from gas to electricity, they might just stop spending money on their bills. They might make their homes more uncomfortable. They might set their thermostat to, let's say, 80 degrees in the summer because they just don't want it to kick on. And that's something that we need to track, because that is a part of this affordability discussion. So if you only track energy burden and all of a sudden people stop spending money on their bills, you don't know why. Okay. So if right now I'm a home, and I use natural gas, and I turn on my air conditioning unit when it's 75 degrees outside, and my energy burden is 5%. Okay. Now let's say I get a heat pump, and all of a sudden my energy burden is still 5% because I'm just not going to spend any more money on it. But now I wait until the average temperature is 90 degrees outside to turn on my air conditioning system. Well, now this is a risk. This is the comfort equation that I'm talking about of now this person has delayed turning on their heat. So this is an indication of inaffordability. So now they have indicated through the data that their bills are unaffordable. And that person needs assistance, they need help. We need to think about how to redesign the rates so that that switch from the gas to the heat pump is not detrimental to the health of the person in the home. Okay. Thanks, Mary. So I think that is it.
Are there any other questions out there? We do have until 1:30. If people want to chime in again. I have a question. So do you envision that this type of analysis is something that a utility could do or would do, should do on like a periodic basis? Or like how frequently is it something you think that they should, it kind of should be part of regular practice, or should it just be like annually? I don't know, like what are your thoughts on how it would be integrated into what they do rather than kind of a one-off at one time?
I would love to see utilities integrate this type of thing, I would say at least 4 times a year, right? You could do it more, but if you're doing it 4 times a year, that can be right before the heating season starts. Let's try to figure out who's going to need help. And then, maybe like December, January, like who's struggling during this heating season. Let's try to get them some help before, they get disconnected in February because it's super cold and they've been struggling this whole time and now their savings is depleted, right? And then you would do like one after heating season, but right before summer season to see, okay, how are people faring during the winter season? How do we think they're going to do in the summer season? Because we know, like, as you're deploying more air conditioning units, now Massachusetts is going to have 2 peaks, right? When you used to mainly have like the winter peak, now it's going to have a summer peak too. So now you got to see, okay, how are people doing, like right after the winter season, really high time of bills. Now they're like the bills should be lower. How are they doing? Let's start thinking about targeting people for help, assistance, awareness in the summer, right? Then you want to look, okay, now we're moving through summer. How are people doing like in July, right? Is there anybody like, or maybe June, right? Right before a heat wave. Is there anyone with a broken air conditioning unit, right? If you are projecting a heat wave is going to come in 2 weeks, then you should run this analysis and say, last year, who had broken air conditioning units? Are they using the air conditioning units now? And you can do that in real time. And you can do that analysis in like less than a week. And you can try to like really let those people know about cooling centers, energy efficiency upgrades, right? Because the way to get people to sign up for energy efficient appliances, if they get air conditioners, is right before, like when they need them, right? They're not going to be thinking about air conditioners in the winter. They're going to be thinking about them in the summer. And so they're kind of like letting them know that there's a better way and there's a way to address your issue right now. And then after summer, of course, you want to like check in and see which intervention was the most successful, which targeting was the most successful, what should we do next season / next heating season, and what are we going to integrate into our next year. And I think that can also just like, if you're doing that across seasons, one, it lets you know how your targeted marketing is doing. And the other thing, it's letting you know how your rate changes are doing, right? Because as I said, a rate increase, it does take about a year for people to adjust. And it's because of how they see their energy bills on their bill system, on their actual bill. So if you kind of look at the bill, right, it says last year in June, you spent this much money, and this year you're projected to spend this much money. So that's where people adjust. They're like, oh man, last year my bills were so high, I'm going to like bring it down. Or they say, oh, last year my bills are good, I'm going to use more. But then they don't learn how much they actually spent until the end of the month, right? And then they're like, oh man, like, it was projected to be one thing. Now it's actually another thing. Now I gotta think through it again, right? But they're like, oh, well, it's warmer out, it's cooler out, right? You got the different temperatures outside. And so that's why it does take a year for people to really like catch up to these rate changes.
I guess I could also see it being something that you, like you rerun the analysis when there's a significant rate change, right? To see like what was the impact of that rate change,
Yeah.
um, to do some kind of that diagnostic. Um, Another question. I guess I'm thinking about it in terms of like, I can see utilities having this as just like a tool in their toolbox. It's like, it can become just something that like, it's a standard part of how they think about taking care of their customers.
Yeah. And, for me, I got my lights cut off. So I was disconnected from my electricity provider when I lived in Massachusetts. Sorry, Eversource, right? We paid our oil bill that month thinking, oh, well, we need to keep our heat on because it's getting cold. And we didn't pay our electricity bill. And then we very quickly learned, which I should have known this because I'm an electrical engineer, but there's always gaps in a person's knowledge, right? So like we very quickly learned that without your thermostat, none of your heating works. So you should always pay your electricity bill first, right? Because your thermostat controls literally every heating source in your home. So, it's like, but when I look back, I was like, wow, I was energy poor. Why was I not aware of all of these subsidies and these programs and these assistance things? And so to me, I'm like, that is one of the challenges of like not knowing about individuals in your service territory, right? Because I was in that 18 to 24-year category. And like if I had just gone to work, I would have definitely not been in the lowest income category, but I was in grad school and I definitely was the lowest income category. So it's very good life lessons, which I now integrate into my work and this type of advocacy attempts. But it is like one of those things of like utilities have notices when you are about to get disconnected. They should include in those notices ways to not get disconnected, right? Or ways to pay your energy bill. And I do think that it is really this reframing around like everybody needs help sometimes, right? Everybody, just because you don't pay your bills, it doesn't mean you didn't want to. It might just mean that you were really struggling and you were trying to do the best with what you had. And, when I first published this paper or this work in 2022, when I first presented it to utilities, the guiding assumption in the utilities is that everybody sets their thermostat where they want them to be. And that's just a flawed assumption. And, I think that's why I spent like the next 2 years, one, trying to make the company, but two, trying to prove it in other utility spaces. Like this isn't just Arizona. It's also happening in Chicago. We got the South, we got the North, and now we got everybody in between, right? And now we're doing that in the gas sector too. And the thing about we assume people set their thermostats where they want them to. That assumes everybody has a thermostat. It assumes everybody has a thermostat, but it forgets about people with fans and people with on-off window units and some of those radiator heatings in those district heating type buildings where it's just on-off, right? And so those types of things that are also like flawing our assumptions about how people can interact with the energy in their home, I think are also like it just is a big lack of awareness of individuals and how people cope and how people are coping in their territory. So I do hope that utilities will use this because it does allow for earlier interventions, but it also just allows for kind of humanizing this energy service because now that electricity is the essential service that enables all other essential services, like I do believe that we need more protections around making it so that people can't get their lights cut off. And as like a last anecdotal piece of evidence, it's interesting because I was also a foster parent. So I had like 3 kids that came into my home, and the through talking with caseworkers, it's if your lights get cut off, you can get your kids taken away because your home is unlivable now, right? So without your electricity, you don't have your refrigeration, so there's no food, right? You don't have water heating, your pipes could all freeze, and it's unlivable for your kids. Well, guess what? It takes like 4 months sometimes to get your kids back. So why is it so hard to get your to keep your kids as opposed to like losing your bills and losing your lights, right? And I do think that like we need to be very intentional about electricity, especially as we are pushing for electrification.
I have one last question. Unless anybody else, if anybody else has a question, please put it in the chat. I don't want to take away the show here. My question is related to, have you seen, or have you any experience with the utilities you've worked with, the regulator allowing costs related to it, or any kind of interactions or directions from regulators in terms of directing utilities to do this type of analysis? Have you any interactions or understanding of regulators in other spaces in this type of work?
So in terms of the work, right, so I'll have two examples. One was like a bit of a sad piece. I'll start with the sad one, then I'll end with the happy one, I guess. So the sad one was like when we went to our electricity utility here in Pittsburgh, and we were trying to say, hey, we can find people without air conditioning units and like help them get signed up to assistance. They said legally we won't do that because our regulator says that we cannot encourage anyone to use more electricity. And I'm like, but what about all the people without air conditioning units? And like you're going to ignore them? They're like, no, we can't encourage them to use more electricity because that goes against energy efficiency. And I, of course, as the electrical engineer, was like, that's not energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is achieving the same level of output with less energy. This is a different output because now people are cooler in their homes. It's really energy technically conservation, but so when I talked to the regulator about that, she said, wow, that's an unintended consequence of that policy we made back in like the 1970s during the oil embargo. So that was something where she just said, I never thought that that would happen, right? Because back then, not having AC wasn't that big of a deal, right? Like it was a lot cooler. We weren't having as many heat waves. It wasn't as extreme of temperatures. And so, that was something that was like kind of eye-opening for me as I was like working through the regulatory space. Now the happy one. So when I talked to people's guests, they were saying that, their regulator so I hadn't talked to the regulator directly, but they were saying that the regulator would most likely be in support of something like this because one, each time they disconnect someone, they have to go out and do a wellness check 3 times, right? So if you can actually track how people are using their energy throughout, like prevent them from getting disconnected, they were saying this is great. This is something our regulators want to see, and we would love to show them this. The other thing is, anytime that they want to increase the rates, they have to show how they are protecting and advocating for their low-income houses. And so because we find houses at pipe freeze risk, because we find houses that have high energy burden, that was another thing that People's Gas actually said that they were really interested in working with me on this. And actually, like it was the president slash CEO of the company that said, I want to work with you, right? So that was something that I believe was very encouraging to me. It kept me going to start this business. So, that is something where I do believe that there is regulatory support for it. And it is one of those things of like, now in the electricity space, we haven't like really promoted the like kind of using more energy in the summer as much. It's more on the energy conservation side and understanding like how electrification impacts like bills and conservation capabilities. So I am kind of like learning, but that's why I like working, with the IRWG, AGO, like, and, just different advocacy groups, because I do feel like, academics is one thing, metrics is another, and then on the ground is a whole other beast, right? And so I do think that the more conversations I have, it's, okay, now how can we use the analytics to really target the people that need help?
Thank you. We're nearing the end here. I'm not seeing any more questions pop up. This presentation was great. I learned a lot. I looked at the slides multiple times. I've read your deliverables and I still learned a lot. So really appreciate the very detailed walkthrough and all of the great Q&A. Thank you everyone for asking the questions. We are hoping to do another one on the long term, TBD on when we'll be able to fit that in. It's a little bit of a sprint to the finish here at the end of the year. But you'll continue to hear from the IRWG. Any final thoughts or words, Dr. Knopp?
So one, I would just like to say thanks to everyone who attended and, asked questions, but also participated, because it was really nice to just see so many participants. And also thanks to the IRWG for like bringing me in, because I do think that like I've also learned a lot about like, what it's going to take to really do this in practice, and like what type of specifics we need to really make sure that we are advocating in the right way. So I just want to like kind of echo the thanks, but also just like thanks for leading the charge, right? Because I do think that, someone like me as an academic, I can say whatever I want because I'm not in the government space and I'm an independent thinker, but I do think like it is really nice to be able to have people that are helping blend like the engineering, the algorithms, and the impact side. And I do think that's how we make like meaningful change. It takes a long time, but we're patient. I'm learning patience. So thank you to everyone.
Sustainable urgency, that's what we like to call it. Well, thank you, everyone. Recording will be available, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you, Dr. Knock.
You too. Bye-bye.